Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Malice in the Mitten. I'm your host, Tracy Preston, along with my bestie, Christine Mulligan. Hey, Christine.
Hey, Trace. Hey, everybody. How's it going? What are we getting into today, Trace? Are we doing part 3? Sorry, I forgot.
Yeah.
I forgot. Yeah, part 3 of the Robison family.
Yeah. And not only is it part 3, it is also how we're ending season 2. That's pretty exciting.
Sweet. That went fast.
Yeah. So if you have not listened to season 2, episode 16, which is part 1, go back and start with that, and then move on to season 2, episode 18, before listening to this one. So let's get into it and let's end this beast. This is season 2, episode 20, part 3, The Robison Massacre at Good Heart, The Suspects. So who are the suspects in the murder of the Robison family? Let's start with Dick's right-hand man, Joe Scalaro. Joe was a well-dressed man. His appearance was slick, and so was his tongue. When I look at photos of him, it reminds me a little bit of a mobster. He had slick-backed black hair, glasses, and wearing fancy suits. So let's learn a little bit more about this guy. After high school, Joe enlisted in the Army, and due to his high score on the military standard intelligence test, quote, he was assigned to the Army Security Agency and given a J38 and Morse code straight keys and taught how to use them. The ASA was the new and secretive branch of the military intelligence, which today we call the National Security Agency. In 1956, Joe was sent to Japan and was a Morse code intercept operator. Joe would decode communications during the Cold War and report his findings. To be able to perform this kind of work, your mind basically has to function like a computer. And to be in this position, you are given top secret clearance. On July 14th, 1959, Joe was honorably discharged. After the Army, Joe attended Harvard, where he studied business and marketing. Now, why Joe only attended for a year, I am not certain. Joe had an affinity for guns and was a competitive trap shooter, which we talked about in episode 1. It was in the spring of 1965 when Joe started working for Dick, and Dick liked everything about Joe. He was well-spoken, a classy dresser, attended Harvard, and he was an Army veteran. Joe possessed experience as an ad broker and had previously placed ads in a newspaper called the Birmingham Eccentric. Now, according to the Library of Congress's Directory of U.S. Newspapers in American Libraries, the Birmingham Eccentric in Birmingham, Michigan, which is in Oakland County, a suburb of Detroit. The paper started in 1879, and its last date of publication under that name was sometime in the late 1960s or very early 1970s. Joe learned about this line of work through his father, as he was in the business of advertisement and was also a manager of a publishing company. Delta Faucet would be a huge client and one that Dick was drooling to get under his company's name, and he thought Joe could assist in landing the account. Dick was right. Before long, Delta Faucet was under the R.C. Robison umbrella. Joe worked on commission, but he was taking draws of $850 per month. With obtaining the Delta Faucet account, Dick was feeling on top of the world. But he was not about to stop there. Oh, no. Dick was a dreamer. He wanted more. He wanted to turn his business into an empire. And he was working on something big, something huge, something that would make him millions. Now, as I mentioned in the previous show, Dick was letting Joe handle the business, the calls, the money, and the running of the ads just a few months before the murders. Dick was less and less visible in the office, and all calls from clients were pushed to Joe to handle. This was a little bit of an issue, though, as clients didn't want to speak with Joe. They wanted to speak with Dick. While Dick was working from home, Joe was running ads for heavy hitters such as Pan Am and United Airlines. But the problem was this. They didn't give Joe permission. They had declined to run their ads, but Joe ran them anyway. And after running the ads, he'd send them a bill. As you can imagine, this was upsetting to the clients and starting to make a poor reputation for the company.
Yeah, so apparently this guy wasn't really doing a great job for Joe then. So was he running the ads without their permission, or was Dick doing it himself? Did you have clarity on that?
It kind of sounds like it was Joe, but was Dick involved? I'm not certain. I don't know if he knew. I couldn't really find out. It's kind of like, it sounds more like it was just Joe doing it, but I'm not 100% on that.
Yeah, because that's kind of like fraud, whenever, I had a business years ago and doing small print ads and whatnot, there would be like 3 stages of proofing. You know what I mean? Like they'd show you the mock-up, you'd make some changes, they'd bring it back. There was like at least 3 stages of proofing just for print ads. So I can't imagine these are commercials and whatnot, right?
Well, these are print ads as well. So R.C. Robison has it's an advertising firm, and then Dick had also started up a magazine called Impresario. So they were running print ads in both.
And then charging them for ads in Impresario, which they were the recipients of that fee. So that's kind of like double dipping on top. So there's some shady business going on.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Super shady.
Okay. Go ahead.
All right. So one day Dick was finally contacted by one of the airlines complaining about the situation and were super peeved to be receiving a bill for an ad they did not approve. And to settle everything, Dick assured them that it had to have been a mistake and just not to pay. So that's just a little background on some of the shenanigans Joe was pulling. Now, it's important to remember Joe was working on commission. Detectives contacted Joe and interviewed him on July 23rd, 1968. During his interview, Joe freely told them that he had purchased 2 handguns in the spring of '68. They were semi-automatic 25 caliber Berettas, which he had purchased through a friend of his that was a gun dealer. Joe went on to say that he had also purchased 100 rounds of Seiko ammunition. Now, this ammunition was not manufactured in the United States. Both Dick and Joe, like many after the Detroit riots, just didn't feel safe and wanted some protection should anything like that ever happen again. So what was that all about? Per Wikipedia, the 1967 Detroit riot is also known as the 12th Street Riot and the Detroit Uprising. It was the bloodiest of urban riots in the United States during the long, hot summer of '67. Police had raided an unlicensed after-hours bar called the Blind Pig. This is one of the deadliest and most destructive social insurgencies between black residents and the police in American history, which lasted 5 days. Joe also mentioned that he had purchased 2 Armalite 22 caliber model AR-7 Explorer survival rifles, which he had bought from his brother-in-law, who was a gun dealer. He also mentioned that he had given one of these to a friend of his.
Giving guns to friends. Yeah. Nothing like protections.
Yeah. Here, I got a rifle for you here and a Beretta for you over here. We're going to be good. Yeah. So police had collected Joe's Beretta and turned it over to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab. But as far as Dick's Beretta, well, that was a mystery. It was nowhere to be found. Out of all the 25 caliber bullet casings collected at the scene of the murders, only one of them was able to be used in the crime lab to make any comparison. So all the other ones were just so, like smashed up and just wasn't a good specimen to use for comparison. One thing they did know about the casing that was recovered is that it was not an American-made casing or bullet. It was not American-made. The Seiko ammunition that Joe had purchased, well, that was manufactured in Finland. When the crime lab fired and tested Joe's gun, the markings did not exactly match the casing found at the cottage. It was determined that Joe's Beretta was not directly involved, but in the report, it did indicate that the missing Beretta pistol from Dick could have possibly been involved. But there was a second weapon used in the murders, and the police knew that weapon was a rifle.
Okay, so Dick's Beretta could have possibly been used and could not be found, and Dick had a rifle that they couldn't find as well.
Correct.
So it's very plausible that both guns used in the murders were at the cabin because they belonged to Dick.
Yeah, could have been. Because remember, Joe said he had given the rifle to a friend. He wasn't very clear on who that friend was. The Beretta definitely was given to Dick.
Okay, so this is why Joe's looking really good as a suspect.
Yeah.
All right, but there were more suspects, right?
Oh, there's a lot more.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Monty and Stephen Shenanigans both had rifles. So remember, Monty and Stephen were the ones that got in the cabin, right?
Right.
Okay. So they were tested. Their guns were tested and no match. The rifles at the Robison's cottage were found and tested. No match. Anywhere they looked and saw rifles, they tested them. No match. Even the tree trimmer, Russell Figg, turned over his rifle. No match. Any of the cottage owners at Blisswood, if they had any rifles, they were turned over and checked as well. But still no match. I think you're getting the point, right? No match, no match, no match. It's also important to know that pretty much everyone up north has guns. There's a lot of wildlife up there. On August 7, 1968, Detective Stearns interviewed Joe Scalaro for a second time, but any details he provided were very lean. Joe said that, quote, Dick was a genius. He's one of the greatest guys I've ever met in my life. He adopted me like a son. We were like brothers. We were inseparable for 3.5 years. We did things personally together, ate lunch together. We spent every moment together. He did confirm a Mr. Robert would be visiting the family, but when asked who he was, Scalaro said, quote, beats the hell out of me. Odd, the detectives thought. Scalaro oversaw the business when Dick was away, his right-hand man, and he doesn't know anything about this guy. Scalaro said, quote, when I would ask Dick about who he was, he wouldn't tell me. Or during conversations, if Dick mentioned Mr. Robert's name, he would say, forget I said that. Next, detectives began digging into the finances of Dick's businesses and found that between 1966 through 1968, Delta Faucet paid R.C. Robison and Associates $50,000 for ads to be run in Impresario, but that the ads were never printed. Another big client of Dick's was scammed for more money than that. So where was all the money going? Shortly before the murders, Dick had hired an estate planner. He had valued his two businesses to be worth approximately $600,000. But little did he know, his businesses were in a financial downward spiral. At the same time, Dick had also called his banker to see if a rather large deposit of $200,000 had been deposited. He learned it had not. It was also during this call that Dick was told that his business account only had $15,000 left. As soon as he found this out, Dick was blowing up Joe's phone to find out what in the hell was going on. The detectives had documented these in their notes. Like, they traced the calls. They could see, like, tons of calls from the cottage to Joe.
Like, tons of calls received, but no time talking on the phone?
No. They were actually talking.
Oh, okay.
Multiple calls. Because, as you can imagine, Dick is probably tweaking out. His business is doing great. Now he's got $15,000 in there. I mean, how do you survive? How does a business survive on $15,000? You have employees. You have printing costs. You have, like, how is that even possible?
Yeah. So, he's got a leak, and we're not sure if it's Dick leaking it or if it's Joe leaking it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm leaning more towards Joe. That's kind of where I'm headed. But again, who knows?
All right.
So when detectives asked Joe about the finances, he basically played dumb, saying that Dick and his accountant were the only ones to deal with that. Joe made it clear to detectives that he never dealt with the accountant or anything that had to do with billing. After their review of the finances, it was clear to detectives that before Joe came along, there were no financial issues or bogus billings for ads. In April of 1968, a couple of months before the massacre, Dick had taken his family to Hawaii for Easter. It was at that time that Dick turned the day-to-day operations of both businesses to Joe, as they were going to be gone for a couple of weeks. But once the Hawaiian vacation had ended, Dick never took those responsibilities back, according to Joe. The accountant handled the finances, but it was Joe that oversaw everything else. He had the keys to the office and the company's checkbook, but he was not to be writing checks. He was to keep the book within his possession and keep it protected. Joe also told the detectives that with all of his added responsibilities in the office, Dick had given him a raise, and a pretty big one, a $700 per week raise, along with a percentage of the shares of both R.C. Robison and Impresario. Really?
So that was like partnering him at that time. That's a lot of money for that time.
That's a lot of money. So in the beginning of the story, Joe works on commission, but yet he was pulling, he was drawing $850 a month. And now he's up to $700 a week? That's a ton of cash.
$850 a month in commissions, but that wasn't what he was getting paid. He was getting paid on top of that, it seems. So now he was getting paid plus $700 a week, plus the $850 in commissions a month.
Yeah.
So he was making bank. That's really, really good money back then.
He was making a lot of money. So detectives also interviewed Joe's wife, his mother, his business associates, and people who worked at R.C. Robison. The detectives were regularly following Joe in marked and unmarked cars. They would regularly just pop into the office to make their presence known. When Joe was out and about on the street, they would even just walk right up to him and strike up a conversation, just talking to him about anything really, not necessarily the murders. They wanted Joe to feel their presence. Wherever Joe went, the detectives followed. As I mentioned, Dick had a small passenger plane in the previous episodes, and he housed it at the Hudson County Airport in Oakland County near his home in Detroit. When detectives arrived there, they were greeted by two managers of the airport. They escorted him to Dick's plane, but when they looked it over, there was nothing worth noting regarding their investigation. But they did, however, learn some valuable information from these men. They learned that Dick had also told them that he was planning something really big financially and even wanted these guys to be a part of it. In the couple of months leading up to the murders, Dick and Joe would frequently visit the airport, almost daily. They would drive around the property as if they were surveilling it. They had also had multiple meetings with these two men. Dick said that by September of 1968, he would become a millionaire with his upcoming business deals, and he had some big ideas for this little airport. He wanted to build luxury motels and townhouses, a cultural center, international tour planning, large warehouses where a variety of goods could be stored, purchased, and shipped. And these two men would manage it all. Dick had also told these men that the funding would not be a problem, as he had 5 wealthy financiers lined up and ready to pull the trigger. Dick had even mentioned that a man by the name of Mr. Robert had even spoken to him on the phone. Well, at least they thought he was the man that they had spoken to on June 12th. They said that Mr. Robert wanted to set up a time to meet with them and work out the details of what Dick presented to them. He said that he would call back again in a week. But to them, something just felt off about the whole thing. They described Mr. Robert's voice to the detectives. It was low and monotone, with frequent pauses when he spoke. They also said that his voice sounded robotic. They also told detectives that Dick had followed up with them to see if Mr. Roberts had reached out to speak with them, and when they affirmed that he had, but nothing had been set up as far as a time to meet, Dick had also told these men that he and his family would be heading to their cottage in Goodhart in just a few days, and if they needed anything while he was away, just call Joe Scalaro.
Well, that seems sketchy. Like, do we ever find out who this Robert is? I know, I'm probably getting ahead of myself. But, or is he just like a mystery man? Because it seems like Dick has these grandiose things happening right before he goes up to the cabin. They just seem a little grandiose, especially when he's only got $15,000 in the bank right now.
Yeah, but he doesn't know that yet.
Oh, okay.
He doesn't know that yet. But yes, very grandiose. He's definitely, has his eye on a big prize. Like he wants to just go, 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 go. So
Yeah.
I kind of feel my take on it is that Mr. Robert is made up. How do you just make millions on a couple of deals? This is 1968. Millions? That seems a little much.
Yeah, the whole thing seems a little bit shady and fantastical.
Mm-hmm. So who was this Mr. Robert? Was he the murderer? Was he one of the 5 investors? Was this a made-up person by Joe? The search to find this man was on. So back to Joe to see what more they could learn. On August 7th, detectives brought Joe into the Detroit headquarters of the state police. They started drilling him from mid-morning to mid-afternoon. The interview was taped, and Joe even agreed to take a lie detector test. Joe said, quote, Dick had big plans for Impresario and R.C. Robison and Associates. I ever heard him mention a man by the name of Mr. Robert, but I didn't know who he was. I had never seen or met him, and I have no idea how to get in contact with this mystery man who is Mr. Robert. When the detectives again asked Joe who was Mr. Robert, he gave the same answer as he had in his first interview. Quote, beats the hell out of me. Maybe he was an investor. Joe said that when he and Dick were talking about the airport deal, he told Dick that this was going to cost a hell of a lot of money, and that's when Dick mentioned the name Mr. Roberts. Then he looked at me and said, forget I said that. Joe continued to deny any knowledge of who this man was, but the detectives continued to push. But Joe kept to his story. He only heard the name Mr. Robert once at the airport, and that was it. Detectives said, don't you think it's strange that Mr. Roberts, if there is such a person that was supposed to be involved in these deals, that he hasn't made any contact? Joe agreed. I think it's extremely strange. Needless to say, there was deception noted from the polygraph that Joe took. Detectives continued with their investigation. They interviewed former employees, neighbors, friends, relatives, and even people that attended the same church as the Robisons did. They had even contacted the Border Patrol in Mexico and Canada to see if a Mr. Roberts had passed through, but no, nothing. Detectives had also learned that Dick's biggest client, Delta Faucet, was planning to sever their ties with R.C. Robison and Associates. Dick was never available to speak to them because he was either away at his cottage, traveling, or working from home and didn't want to be disturbed with any calls. They didn't want to deal with Joe. Detectives also learned that Joe had called Delta Faucet's main office, which is in Indiana, in July of 1968. He was looking for an advance in ad money due to a shortage of operational money. An advance was given to Joe, but they were not sure if Joe was just taking the money or using it for the business.
There was nothing to track that if he used it for the business. I mean, I would think that the business books would note that kind of advance and what he did with them.
Yeah, right, but this is Delta Faucet. They're the ones that are saying, did he really use this for the business or is he just taking our money? The detectives took a little trip down to Indiana and they confirmed the advances were given. While there, they were given copies of all the transactions between Delta Faucet and R.C. Robison. They were also given some canceled checks that were written out to Dick's business in total. They added up to more than $81,000. Upon their return to Michigan, they'd handed over the checks to the state police's latent print unit, and they wanted them to look for any prints that belonged to Joe. The motive they were thinking for the murders? Money.
Yeah, stereotypical. That's exactly what it always is. Money or cheating.
Yep. Those are the two big ones.
That's the biggie. The big one is financial gain.
Yeah. Detectives also interviewed a man by the name of Robert Anderson. He was an advertising salesman. He had started working with Dick in April of 1968. So remember, Joe started in March of 68 as well. Robert was currently still working there, but now he's under Joe because, right, the murders have already happened, so now his boss is Joe. Robert told detectives that he had a feeling that something just wasn't above board with this company. He said something to the effect of false billing and overcharging their clients. He didn't have any proof to show them, but he was certain that if they took a good hard look at the company's records, they would more than likely find something. Shortly after the murders, Joe had purchased R.C. Robison and Associates for basically nothing, just $3,500, and it was all his: the assets, the debts, and the financial records. Detectives jumped on the opportunity to confront Joe about the allegations of overcharging Delta Faucet, and before long, they had all the records they needed spanning the years between 1960 and 1968. After the detectives reviewed all of the documents they had obtained, to them it had become more and more clear that money was the motive. The detectives contacted the Oakland County Prosecutor's Office. They had told the Oakland County Assistant Prosecutor that they suspected financial fraud perpetrated by Dick or Joe or even both. They requested an accountant be assigned to review the documents that they had in their possession. Lucky for them, a man by the name of Eugene Friedman, who was an assistant prosecutor, also happened to have been an agent for the Internal Revenue Service before becoming a prosecutor. So, Friedman was given the company's financial records. He reviewed them in the offices of R.C. Robison for 2 full days. Friedman did find overcharges to Delta Faucet in the amount of $3,000 in 1965, $6,000 in 1966, $13,000 in 1967, and $27,000 in the first half of 1968. It was also discovered that ads that were paid for were never run. On May 1st, 1968, detectives were contacted by the Latent Print Lab. They had a hit. Joe's fingerprints were identified on all 7 checks. A few weeks later, Robert Anderson, the man who had worked at R.C. Robison, the guy who said that something's fishy is going on, well, he just showed up at the police station, and he spoke to detectives and said, quote, "If you ever need to interview me again, you're going to have to call me in Chicago." Robert told them that he had just quit his job. He was moving immediately, never to return, as he was in fear that Joe would harm him or his family. He said that Joe was a liar, a thief, and that he had mental problems. Joe's passing bad checks, and the company is in big financial trouble. He also said that he thinks that Joe had something to do with the Robison family murders.
Okay, so this guy's like pointing fingers, and now that he's on the outs with him, all of a sudden he's like, yeah, he's the demon. He's the evil one. Go get him. So what happened to him?
Nothing.
That just sounds super sus.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Goes to the cops of his own accord to repoint the finger, like, go get him. Like, why aren't you guys going to get him?
Yeah. So this is the second time first he's like, hey, yo, listen, something is not kosher over here. And now no matter, I don't know what else he knew. I don't know if he was snooping around. I don't know if he was chitty-chatting with whoever at R.C. Robison. But he's like, yeah, something's up with this guy.
He's definitely fanning the flames, for sure. So something was happening to him, too. And he's running for his life. He's leaving so Joe can't find him and his family. He knew more than he was saying, definitely.
Yeah, I think so, too. Big time. Now, on Friday, September 12, 1969, Joe Scalaro was arrested by Detectives Stearns and Fliss, but it wasn't for the Robison murders. What they got him for was writing bad checks to the National Bank of Detroit. Quote, according to bank records, Joe wrote the check on August 14th against an account with a balance of just $30. He then deposited the check into the R.C. Robison account. According to police records, the owner of Planned Auto Management leased 2 cars to Joe on August 15th. Joe had written a check in the amount of $1,170.26 to the owner, but that check bounced. When the owner talked to Joe about it, he wrote him another check, but this check came from another account, which was from the National Bank of Detroit. This check also bounced. On June 20th, 1968, Joe had dropped off one of his vehicles at Planned Auto Management as it needed some repairs. He was given a loaner in the meantime. The repairs would only take a couple of days. And when the repairs were finished, a call was placed to R.C. Robison to let Joe know that his car was ready. But he was told Joe wasn't in the office. He was up north. Now take note of that date, June 20th. Right, so they believe that the murders happened on the 22nd.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Now he doesn't really have an alibi for where he was. Which, actually, did you say where he was?
Not yet.
All right, so his alibi is sketchy.
Now, I'm sure Joe was sweating bullets when he was arrested. You know, he must have thought they were arresting him for the murders. And after being in custody for just a handful of hours, Joe's mother obtained an attorney for her son. And after speaking with detectives, his attorney discovered that Joe was arrested for writing bad checks. The attorney said that they would no longer be speaking with Joe. And before they knew it, the check kiting charge was dropped, which I find that interesting. Can you believe it? I mean, these detectives must have lost their frickin' minds over this. But Stearns and Fliss just kept working the case. They went back to see Dick's accountant for R.C. Robison. Detectives wanted to know more about payroll. The accountant said, quote, "All I know is that every time we try to call Dick, he wasn't in the office. He wasn't in the office at all as far as we know from roughly the 1st of May. And in the past, Dick would always contact his accountant. If he wanted to give an employee a $10 raise, either he would call us and ask us if he could afford it, number one, and if nothing else, what the deduction would be on the check. So we always knew about a raise or anything like that in advance. When he bought his plane, same thing. He wanted to know if he could afford to buy it. There was a case a year before when he wanted to build a sauna next to his building. He had called us and asked if he could afford that. So normally, anything he spent any kind of money on, he would call and ask first. The accountant went on to tell detectives that, quote, Joe went from a commission-based pay to a regular salary in early 68. He went from making $10,000 a year with a $4,000 annual allowance for expenses, along with a company car and compensation package. All of that came out to just over $1,100 a month. Then, at the beginning of May, about the same time Dick was unavailable, remember he was in Hawaii. So at the same time Dick was unavailable to go over the company accounts, Joe got a substantial raise. On May 9th, Joe drew a check for $1,500, which was in the middle of the month, and that was not normal. 5 days later, Joe drew a check for his normal wages, and at the end of May, Joe took a check for $800, which was approximately double his normal pay. In the month of June, Joe increased his pay to $2,000 bi-weekly. Joe also took roughly $1,500 worth of expense checks. The accountant went on to say that Dick made it clear that he did not want Joe having anything to do with the checkbook and wanted his nose kept out of it. The detectives also wanted to know if Dick's handwriting was on any of the checks that Joe received. It was not.
Okay, so first off, can I just point out that this sucker, at his most, when he's drawing double his paycheck, he's at $4,000 a month. Could you just take a minute with me and be like, WTF? At $4,000 a month in 1968, you were considered rich and wealthy?
Yeah, he was
And
living.
now, if you make $4,000 a month, you can barely afford food, let alone a roof over your head.
I know.
Bananas. Okay, I just needed a minute to be like, what in the
Actual.
what is that?
Yeah, man, he was rolling in the dough.
Yeah, that's crazy to me.
Yeah.
Like that's not that long ago. That's a fraction of what you need to live a normal life nowadays. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm sick of shock of that. But you were running those numbers, and I was like, oh my God! And he's rich, and not too far off of this, you're having private planes. Wait, what?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a whole different world. Okay.
Yeah. So,
But the thing is, what I don't understand is this accountant was the only one that knew all the numbers and the money. but somehow there were no red flags for him with how the business went from supposedly having so much in it to then all of a sudden the 15,000 that Dick's about to find out. If the accountant is the one that did this, and he's saying that he doesn't want Joe to have, so Dick says he doesn't want Joe to have his hands in the checkbook. What happens to the accountant? I mean, because this is before the murders where he starts drawing all this money out, right?
Right. Now remember, it's also Dick's fault because he wouldn't take any calls.
Okay.
Right. So the accountant, I believe, did try to get a hold of Dick, but he wouldn't answer. And any calls that came his way, he was like, "No, I don't want to talk to you. Talk to Joe." Like, he's planning like this huge thing, and that's where he wants to focus because he trusts Joe completely, right? He doesn't know about any of this business, but you would think that if your accountant keeps trying to get a hold of you, you might want to take that call. So he totally, I put that on Dick.
But I feel like the accountant has got to know more about the shady stuff than he's letting on.
Yeah, that makes sense, right?
I don't know, the accountant, the accountant feels very sus to me right now, too. Okay, so go ahead. What's going on with the checks that don't have Dick's fingerprints on it before we left off, right?
Well, at this point, it's been a year since the murders occurred. And there were many, many tips that were coming in, but nothing was panning out. There was now a $5,000 reward out there for an informant if their tip led to an arrest. And the tips just kept coming in, either by phone or by mail. And people were turning people in left and right. Check this person out, check that person out. So, for example, a hitchhiker was turned in because he was wearing a military jacket. That didn't pan out. A Lansing woman turned her husband in because he was gone for a few days up north during the time of the murders, but he was just fishing for perch. That cracks me up. A wife is turning in her husband. A mechanic up in Petoskey turned in a customer because he had a hot temper and a lot of guns, but he had sold those guns just a few years back. A friend turned in a drinking buddy of his because he had bragged about spending a pretty penny on a ring for his girlfriend. A woman turned in her 2 sons because she said they were just no good and that they should be looked at. Isn't that crazy? Now, each tip that came in was followed up on, but again, nothing.
Well, I don't know. That ring thing sounds a little sus because the wife did lose a very big ring. So how big was this ring that this kid bought for his girlfriend?
I don't know.
I would have been interested in that one.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure they didn't give that detail out to the public.
Right. I have no idea.
Yeah, if I was a detective, I would have been like, oh, a ring, huh? Yeah, let me try to project that sucker out.
Yeah. So one day, detectives received a call from a man named Carl Albrecht. He lived in Birmingham. He said he had some valuable information to share and gave his address. Carl was from Germany. He was also a neighbor of Joe Scalaro. He had told detectives that he and Joe regularly went target shooting with Joe's AR-7, and it stuck out to him because he didn't know those types of guns were here in the United States. Carl was familiar with the AR-7 because he had served in the military in Germany. And he just couldn't believe that civilians would be able to get these types of guns here. Carl went on to tell detectives that in June of 1968, Joe had asked Carl if he would place a call for him, and if he would, Joe would pay him $10. He said that Joe told him that he was working on a big deal at work, but one of the men that was in on the big deal had bailed out, and Joe really needed someone to make this call and pretend to be that employee. Carl thought this was a little odd, but hey, $10 is $10, right? Joe wrote down exactly what Carl was to say and asked him to read the statement out loud a couple of times for practice before he made the call. But Carl had such a heavy German accent that it just wasn't going to work. So then Carl called a friend of his to come over to help. But Joe wasn't happy with this guy either, as he too had a heavy German accent. So he had another friend give it a go. Finally, someone Joe approved of. The name of the man they were calling was Mr. Robison. but they couldn't remember who it was that they were trying to impersonate. Joe dialed the number and handed the phone over to the man who passed the script test. He remembered a young girl had answered the phone, and he requested to speak with Mr. Robison. He had strict instructions from Joe that he was not to linger and carry on any type of conversation with Mr. Robison. If he was asked any questions, he would tell Mr. Robison to contact Mr. Scalaro. Though he couldn't remember word for word what the script said, it went something like this. Quote, I'm calling in regard to the deal we have been working on with Mr. Scalaro, and my client has informed me that he will go as much as 5, but no more. If you want any more of the details, contact Mr. Scalaro. He has the complete package. Detectives checked the phone records from Joe's home and found that these calls were made from there. Their records show that 2 calls were made from his house to the Robison cottage in Goodhart on June 24th, 1968. The man who placed the call to Dick said he sounded quite pleased with the information, and in less than 24 hours, Dick and his family were murdered. Detectives not only noted these 2 calls, but many calls took place between the cottage and Joe just before the murders. So remember, that's the day that they believe that they were murdered on the 25th. These calls were on the 24th. June 20th is when he dropped off his vehicle. So it was a few days later when they called him back to say, hey, your car's ready. So he dropped it off on the 20th.
Okay, so that lines up then.
Yeah. In one of the interviews with Joe, he threw out an alibi before he was even asked of his whereabouts at the time of the murders. Joe said he had been at a plumbing convention at Cobalt Hall in Detroit on June 25th. So again, that's the day that they pinned down as the day of the murders. Joe went on to say that there was a deluge of rain that day, unlike anything he had seen in quite some time. So Joe thought he ought to go to the Robisons' home to make sure that everything was okay, since the Robisons were up in Goodhart. He said when he checked on the home, rain had gotten into the basement. So he called Dick to let him know that he had taken care of the water for them. Also, during this call, Dick reminded Joe that they were all leaving that day for their trip to Kentucky to purchase the horse farm, and then to Florida to purchase the oceanfront condos. Joe went on to say that he had also gone to Montgomery Ward's to shop for a radio. He said he was there for about 30-40 minutes before he left for the plumbing convention around noon, as Delta Fawcett would be there and he wanted to stop in and say hi. He said that he had walked around the convention for a while. He said he had spoke with a man named Abbott and a couple of other guys there. Joe then went across the street to the Pontchartrain Hotel, where he had had a couple scotch and sodas at the bar. He then decided that he would take a cab to Hudson's department store because shopping relaxed him. But when asked for the details such as, do you remember the bartender? Did you talk to anyone? Do you have a receipt from the cab ride? Did you talk to anyone at Hudson's that you can remember? All of Joe's answers were nope. I don't remember the bartender. Nope. I didn't talk to anyone at the bar. Nope. I don't have a receipt from the cab. And no, I didn't talk to anyone at Hudson's. Joe said he had also drove to the office to make sure the roof wasn't leaking, as he had a flat roof, and it was common for the downspouts to be clogged up with debris. Good thing he went back, he said, because just like he thought, the downspouts were clogged. So he cleaned those out in the pouring rain. Sus. Really? He said he called his wife while he was at the office to let her know that he was going to be late getting home and what he was doing. Then he said that after he left the office, he swung back by the Robisons for one last check on the basement prior to heading home. At this point, it was getting dark. He did another cleanup in the basement and then called the Robisons' neighbor and talked to her for a while. Once he hung up with her, he tried to call Dick again to give him another update. But the phone just rang and rang and rang. Finally, Joe was going to be heading home, to his home in Birmingham. He told detectives that the trip took longer than usual because of the downpour. He had to take an alternate route. When he finally got home, it was close to midnight, could have even been later. And when he arrived home, his wife was in bed sleeping. But detectives were not really buying into this story. For one, the plumbers' convention at Cobalt Hall was a 3-day event, which ended on June 25th, the day that Joe said he was there. Joe said he left his office at noon, went shopping for a radio, and then went to the convention. But the thing is this. Detectives had interviewed quite a few people that were at the convention, and they learned that by noon, exhibitors were breaking down their booths to leave by 1, which was about the time Joe said he had arrived. Detectives also inspected the basement of the Robison home. They didn't see any water damage. They had even spoken to the Robison's neighbor, Margaret, and she didn't recall hearing from Joe on June 25th, the night of the storm, and neither did Joe's wife, Laura. However, she did tell detectives she found wet clothes and a wet coat in the laundry room the next morning. If Stearns and Fliss could just find that second .25 caliber Beretta pistol that Joe said he had bought for Dick, and where was the missing rifle?
One of those big Michigan lakes you love.
That's right. It makes sense. Stearns and Fliss also interviewed a man by the name of Bill Harrington. Bill lived on the property of one of the gun ranges Joe came to frequently. The two men became friends in early 1968, and he remembered Joe telling him that he wanted to buy 2 pistols, one for himself and one for his boss. Harrington also told police that Joe picked up the guns in April of '68. This information jived with what Joe's wife said. She confirmed the date and told detectives that she was with Joe at the Birmingham Gun Club when he purchased them. His wife also said that when they got home, Joe put one of the guns in a drawer where she stored her purses, and he put the other gun in his dresser drawer along with the ammunition. Scalero told detectives he had given the gun to Dick in February or March, but according to Joe's wife, she said the gun remained in her purse drawer until mid-June when her husband took it with him to work, and he was going to give it to Dick. In March of 1969, detectives learned that Joe purchased a .22 caliber rifle at the Montgomery Ward store in Detroit. You know, when Joe told them that he was shopping for a radio on the 25th, the day of the murders. But Joe had told them he bought the gun on July 1st of 1968, which would have been after the murders, but before the discovery of the bodies. So why in the heck would he buy the gun from this store instead of his gun-dealing brother-in-law?
That is a really good question and highly sus. And this same rifle is the one that's missing?
Yes.
That's super interesting.
Mm-hmm. So remember the interview with Carl, Joe's neighbor, the German guy who said he was surprised that an AR-7 could be bought in the United States by a civilian? Well, Stearns and Fliss remembered that when they had Joe in custody, Joe had told them at one time he had owned an AR-7 .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle, of which he had bought from his brother-in-law. However, he couldn't produce them for police because Joe said he had gave one of the rifles to a friend who also worked in the advertising business, and the other rifle he gave back to his brother-in-law. So, detectives paid a visit to Herbert, Joe's brother-in-law. Now here's hoping that Robert kept solid records of his sales. When detectives visited Herbert, they found that he was no longer in the gun business, but when he was, he did keep meticulous records of all sales and special orders. Herbert told him that he had sold Joe one AR-7 on September 30th, 1966, and one on November 28th, 1966. He also told them that both he and Joe had gone to his father-in-law's property and both shot one of the AR-7s, but one thing his records did not show was any logging of receiving the AR-7 that Joe said he had given back to him. He absolutely denied that Joe gave it back. Next, detectives found the advertising colleague that Joe said he had given one of the AR-7s to. This man was now living in Chicago. Oh, interesting. That's the dude. That's the guy who came into... Oh my goodness, that's the guy who came into the police department. Remember, if you want to talk to me again, you're going to have to get me to Chicago. I bet that's who this is.
You think? So he was in on the murders, and then he was running for his life.
Could have been.
Interesting.
Good thread. All right, so that man is now living in Chicago, and as luck would have it, he still had the AR-7. This man had given detectives permission to test the gun, and it was handed over to the Michigan State Crime Lab in East Lansing. It was confirmed that an AR-7 is what was used in the murders of the Robisons, and it was the AR-7 that made the bullet holes in the window of Somerset. It just wasn't this AR-7 from the man in Chicago. It was time for the detectives to pay a visit to the property of the father-in-law where Joe and Herbert shot the AR-7. Could the casings still be there? Herbert said they should be there, but it's going to be quite the job to find them. Herbert would go along with them to show them where they were shooting, and as luck would have it, utilizing a metal detector, they freaking found the bullet casings. In all, they found 21 shell casings, which looked like they were fired from an AR-7. The next morning, they delivered the shell casings to the crime lab in East Lansing, and it was determined that at least 5 of the shells were fired from the same weapon as the 4 .22 caliber shells from the crime scene. 15 other shells exhibit similar characteristics and could have been fired from the same weapon as the evidence shells from the scene as well. Could this finally be the end of the investigation? The detectives were so ready to finally formally charge Joe, and all that was left was to submit the report to Donald Nagel, the Emmett County prosecutor. Meanwhile, Joe had taken a second polygraph test. Quote, "Did you know an AR-7 would be used to shoot the Robisons?" "No." "Do you know where the AR-7 is now?" "No." "Did you lie to the police about giving the AR-7 back to your brother-in-law?" "No." All of Joe's responses indicated deception. In the post-test interview, there was still no confession from Joe.
Egotistical, maniacal con man. Why wouldn't he be deceptive? I mean, this is like textbook criminal.
Yeah. And it's like he thinks he's the smartest man in the room.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's a crazy story.
Okay, so my brain is still reeling. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but it's like, duh, this guy's the murderer. But we started this out 3 episodes ago where you tell me this is still an unsolved crime.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Okay, so what happens? I don't understand. How they let this slippery sucker go?
Because he's so slippery. While Stearns and Fliss were searching for bullet casings at the father-in-law's, the Internal Revenue Service ceased Joe's business as he owed $14,000 in back taxes. Agents were cataloging Joe's assets to be sold at auction. Everything was caving in on Joe now. A magazine called Show Dog that he had been trying to get off the ground, well, that fell through. He had outside investors that gave him $10,000 to get this up and running. I can't believe people are still giving him money. That's how good he is. Joe's vehicle got repossessed because he couldn't keep up on the payments. He tried to buy a car from a friend, of which Joe had handwritten a promissory note to be payable on March 2nd of 1973. Joe couldn't afford to pay any of the remaining staff that he had inherited from Dick's business, so he had to let them go. So Kathleen, Joe's mother, she started working for him as a receptionist, so everything has fallen to pieces, which to me feels like karma.
Yeah, a little bit. And the thing is that this guy, Joe, he was basically just a shiny con man from the start.
Yeah.
I mean, he come with anything, but being a snazzy dresser with a cool demeanor and being a veteran, like those were his big claims to fame, right?
Yeah, huge IQ, right? Remember, he was super wicked smart.
Well, wicked smart, as in like a con man that just talks a lot of shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right. This is all tracking. Okay, go ahead.
Track.
Of course you got to yell at business because he's a con man. It's all based on nothingness.
Exactly. So after an 18-month-long investigation and in the early part of 1970, Stearns and Fliss compiled their investigative report. It was a big one. They packed it up in the car and headed north because they wanted to hand deliver the interviews, the polygraph tests, the lab findings, autopsy, and ballistic reports. They want to give that personally to the prosecutor because these guys, I'm going to tell you right now, these guys worked every angle. Detectives had detailed the murder weapons, the time of the crime, the discovery of the bodies. Their chief suspect, and the motive of embezzlement. The report included, quote, the suspect was left in charge of the business for about 3 months prior to the murder and was left with signed blank checks. His salary increased from $600 take-home semi-monthly to $2,000 take-home semi-monthly. He was also receiving expense checks ranging from $300 to $1,000 as often as twice a week. The investigation indicates that the victim was not aware of this until June 25th, 1968, and this can be verified by the accountant and the records. It is believed that he did learn of it on June 25th, 1968, meaning Dick, and confronted the suspect with it by phone 4 times on June 24th, 1968. The suspect purchased 2 .25 caliber Beretta Model 950B pistols, serial number 47910 and 47836, along with 100 rounds of .25 caliber Seiko brand ammunition. The suspect still had serial number 47910. Serial number 47836 is missing, and the suspect states he gave this gun along with 100 rounds of Seiko ammo to the victim on the day after he purchased them. However, officers' investigation has failed to turn up the latter. The suspect's wife told officers that the suspect had both of the guns in the house until about June 25th, 1968. The suspect purchased an Armalite model AR-7 .22 caliber rifle, serial number 68314. He purchased another Armalite model AR-7 rifle with a serial number 75878 shortly after he purchased the first one. In Chicago, officers had checked this gun out and it was not used in the murder, believed to have been in the spring or summer of 1967. The suspect and his brother-in-law fired number 75878 on some private property near Union Lake. Officers recently checked that location and located numerous empty casings. The crime lab has checked these out and has identified these as having come from the same gun that was used in the murder. The suspect advised officers that he had given his gun to his brother-in-law sometime prior to the murders, but this has been found to be false. The gun is also missing. This gun is so rare and so unusual that even most sport and gun shops never have handled or even seen them until June 25th, 1968. The suspect left the office in Lathrop Village about 11 a.m. and didn't arrive home until after 11 p.m. And this is by his own statement and was confirmed by his wife. He gave officers an alibi as to his activities and whereabouts on the day of the murders, but officers checked those out and found it to be false. Respectfully submitted. It would be weeks before Prosecutor Nagel would even read the file. It took him nearly a month. Nagel pointed out that there just wasn't enough evidence to issue a warrant. Quote, the report details that Joe had failed 3 lie detector tests. He could not account for at least 11 hours of his time on the day of the murders and a financial motive to commit the crimes. He knew the exact location of the Robison's cottage and had once owned the same make and model as both murder weapons. But what the report didn't do was place Joe at the scene of the crime at the time of the murders.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as all of this kind of says, duh, Joe did it, for the prosecutor, he needed something that said that he was in that area, not just that he has missing time and his story doesn't match. There's got to be something that places him in that area. Maybe he stopped and got gas somewhere and somebody's seen his car, or footprints that fit his feet that, is a different size from anybody else at the house. Something that's got to place him physically there. Or a weapon in his possession, which they're obviously not finding. Because those Great Lakes are great for some things.
Exactly. I mean, and it's, when you read everything that was submitted, it's all circumstantial. You got to get the man there.
Yeah, that's what I was saying in a long-winded way. So far, everything's circumstantial. I mean, it commonsensically, it's like, duh. But at the same time, it still leaves room for somebody else actually may have done it.
Correct.
Which is unlikely, because this guy is just sus from the ground up. But, okay, go ahead.
All right, so Stearns and Fliss had no other choice. They had to get back to work on solving the Robison murders. These poor guys must have just been exhausted. John Babcock was a reporter from the Petoskey News, and he had been covering this case for his newspaper. In his opinion, detectives needed to look somewhere else besides Joe Scalaro. John thought that they should be looking a little more closely at the man who discovered the bodies, Monty Bliss. Monty had said that he was missing a hammer. So remember, there was a hammer involved too, right? Bloody hammer, the little girl and Dick both had fractured skulls and half crescent shaped wounds.
Is Monty Bliss the guy that had the helper?
Yes. So Monty Bliss, his father was Chauncey Bliss, right?
So are we back to the fact that this helper was the sus one that I said, I think, in the first episode? Like, wait a minute, that helper, who's the helper?
Well, no, you're right. No. So Monty, Chauncey's son, Chauncey owns Blisswood. Monty grew up there. He was, remember, between him and his dad, they would mine the flowers and the grounds and all that kind of stuff. I think the helper you're talking about was Fig's helper, the tree trimmer.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But it was Monty who found the body. So they're like, hey, go back and look at that dude, right? Because Monty had even said that he was missing a hammer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the whole skull damage, yes. Okay, track it. God.
Yep. But Monty did not own a .25 caliber Beretta or a .22 caliber AR-7, which were the agreed upon murder weapons.
Right, but aren't we saying that those weapons were supposedly at the cabin, right?
So the Beretta pistol, that was given to Dick. They couldn't find it, right? Because they were like, oh, yeah, I gave it to Dick. And then the AR-7s, Joe had said he gave one to the friend, the guy who moved to Chicago, and he said the other one he gave back to his brother, the gun dealer.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, so the only gun that they should have been able to locate would have been the Beretta.
Okay, which coulda, shoulda, mighta been at the cabin. And then Joe, okay, so what about Joe being in cahoots with this guy? He needed somebody else, because there was definitely more than one person that did that debauchery.
Agreed. So
yeah, all right. So what happens with this thread? Go ahead.
All right, I'm going to pull it. So Monty had already passed the lie detector test, and his hunting rifle was test fired and cleared. So remember, they were going through everybody, give me your rifle, da-da-da, no match. The only issue Monty had with Dick was the way he was really strict with raising his children. So he's cleared. Who next? Remember all the secretaries that Dick had? Remember in part 1, he had the real weird leg fetish? He'd have his secretaries come into his office, hike up their skirt. He'd stare at them for an hour. Yeah.
Stereotypical greaseball man in the 60s. Yes.
Yeah. And, I've been thinking about that. I'm thinking, oh, my gosh, if I was one of those ladies, I was summoned into the office, hiking up my skirt to have someone stare at me for an hour. Like, mentally, that's horrible. Well, the detectives were not really thinking that it was the women, but, a few years had passed since all that stuff, and these women, I think there were like 2 or 3 of them that they went and talked to, they were married at this point. They were wondering, if they had told their husbands about it, could it possibly have been one of the husbands? Like, how dare you disrespect my wife?
Okay. All right, so I can see that stretch because dudes definitely, the jealousy factor and the degradation factor that you demean my wife like this and I'm a man and my wife, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, that I get, but it's still kind of a far-fetch.
Yeah. But, these guys are checking everybody out. These guys were dogs with a bone. Like, they were like, okay, well, let's try this, let's try that, let's try this, let's try that. So they checked them all out, but nope, nothing there. So they're cleared. Boom. Then there was the Leavenworth letter theory. This is interesting. On January 12, 1970, the Michigan State Police received a letter from an inmate in a maximum security federal prison. The letter said, quote, I have the information and know the killer of the Richard C. Robison family in Goodhart, Michigan in June of 1968. There is a time to talk, and now is the time, sir. The letter was written by a man named Alexander Bloxam. He was a man from Alabama. He ended up in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary by his 40th birthday. He said, quote, "I cannot keep this inside of me any longer, knowing that I am in prison for 25 years on a bank robbery that I had no part of." Alexander Bloxam had been out on parole from April 3rd, 1968, until he was arrested for a parole violation and bank robbery on July 25th, 1968. Special Agent Williams of the FBI decided it would be worth looking into, so he paid a visit to Alexander at the prison. Yes, like most prisoners, they are looking for some kind of a deal, but with the Robison murder still being unsolved, it was worth a shot. Alexander had been a career criminal in and out of prison since he was a teenager. But what if? So here's the story. Alexander was in Detroit in a halfway house where he lived after being on parole. It was here that Alexander ran into an old acquaintance of his, an old skinny white man named Mark Brock. The two of them had met in a Jackson prison, and like Alexander, Mark had also been on the inside since he was a young man. Alexander was really thinking of walking the straight and narrow path this time, but he just couldn't stay away from risky behavior. He kind of tended to do whatever people told him to do. Mark wanted Alexander to go buy a car. He gave him the money, and off to the dealership he went. He purchased a 1963 black sedan. Then the two men drove an hour north and parked in a parking lot of a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant. And I think back then, maybe it was called Colonel Sanders. Do you remember that? When we were younger, was it Colonel Sanders, a Kentucky Fried Chicken?
Oh, you're dating yourself. I don't know about... I've only known KFC my whole life.
Yeah. Listen, girl, you're only a couple years younger than I am. Lock it up.
Yeah, I mean, Colonel Sanders was the face of it, but I don't remember it being Colonel Sanders.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, Well, when they got there, Mark went inside the restaurant and then a short while later came out with, quote, "a tall, bookish-looking stranger," and he had held a finger up to his lips. Mark did, not the bookish-looking stranger. Alexander knew not to say a word. It was Friday, June 21st, 1968. Mark told Alexander that he had a job to do up north, but Alexander could not go because, quote, "there weren't no colored men up in Goodhart." Mark told Alexander to give him the keys to the car, along with the title and the registration. So he did. Alexander said, quote, "if I saw that other man in the parking lot, I saw him real good. He was white, looked like he was about 50 years old. He was 6 feet tall and about 220 pounds. He came up to the car and leaned his head in and said that if Mark does his job well, then Joseph or Scalaro will make sure that Mark is taken care of." Mark then went to Toledo to buy some guns before he went up north. Mark returned June 27th, just 6 days later, and he gave the keys back to Alexander. He said, quote, "take it over to your people's house and put it up on some blocks, 'cause I don't want it out in circulation." He came up to my room late after supper, and he brought a briefcase, a smooth leather one, brown leather. It had a zipper running all the way around it and maybe some gold initials. He opened it up and showed me a paper where he had written out what I should do just in case he comes up dead. I should read what was wrote and do what it said. Inside were investment bonds, 8 to 10 canceled checks with a rubber band around them, and the words Richard Robison Company printed in the upper left-hand corner. 3 rolls of tape for a dictaphone machine, and a photograph of a man, a woman, and 4 children standing on a boat. Mark took all of these things out of the briefcase and put them in a manila envelope. He taped all 4 sides and hid it in my closet. Then Mark pulled out a bread knife and cut up the briefcase. We went outside and we burned the pieces of leather. Alexander was missing his family and he wanted to get down to Alabama. Mark gave him the okay to go and a wad of cash to buy a new Pontiac Bonneville for the trip. He also gave him the manila envelope and a heavy black suitcase along with his new assignment. Quote, "get rid of the suitcase and get rid of it for good." He was also told that he was not to look inside of it. It had a lock on it, and he would not be given the key. Alexander figured the suitcase controlled guns, but he never did try to look inside of it. Once Alexander was down south, he said, quote, One day I went over there to the foundry, and I heaved that case into one of the rusted-out boxcars bound for the furnace. Now that he had a chance to visit his family and dispose of the heavy suitcase, he had to get back to Detroit and let Mark know, keep his job, and report in with his parole officer. He said that before he left, he told his brother about the secret envelope where he had hidden it, which was in his parents' bedroom. If anything happens to me, open the envelope and follow the instructions inside. His brother said that he knew of a better place to hide the envelope, so his brother was going to head toward Chicago, and he was going to take that envelope with him. Alexander got back to Detroit on July 23rd. He and 3 other men were arrested for bank robbery. All were found guilty. But before they were all off for their designated prisons, Mark confessed to Alexander that he had killed the Robisons with another man named Robert Matthews. They did it together. He said, quote, "We went to the cottage and knocked on the door, and I faked a heart attack. While I was lying on the floor, Mr. Robison was trying to help me. Matthews came in and started shooting. The wife was the first one down, and then one of the kids tried to run, so we took him down too. Then we just killed them all." One of the officers pulled out a photo and asked Alexander if the man in the picture was the same man that was at the Kentucky Fried Chicken. Alexander said he didn't think it was the same man and to go talk to Mark or hook me up to your machine. I'll take your liar's test. So detectives planned to get a polygrapher to Leavenworth. Next, the detectives made plans to travel to Atlanta. There was another interview they needed to conduct there, and that interview would be with Mark Brock. In the federal prison in Atlanta, they met with Mark on February 11, 1970. Mark said that he did know Alexander, knew him quite well. He said, quote, "I gave him money to buy a Dodge and then the Bonneville. Yes, they cut up and burned the briefcase together, and yes, they did a few small-time robberies together. Yes, he went to Toledo to buy guns. Yes, he knew his way around northern Michigan. Yes, he took a trip up there in June of '68. Yes, he and Alexander spent time at the same halfway house. And yes, Alexander did drive him to the fried chicken restaurant in Flint." When asked if he had a scheduled meeting with someone inside the restaurant, Mark said, "I could have." When he was asked if he kept that appointment, he said, "I could have met someone there on a business deal." When asked if he was asked to be a trigger man, he said yes. Mark was asked when was the last time. Well, June of '68. He was then asked, would you have ever considered taking on this kind of job if the price was right? Sure. I would say $5,000 at least. But when he was asked if he killed the Robison family, he replied no. He said, quote, "I'm not going to take a lie detector test either, so don't even ask me about something like that. I'm not going to tell you anything I might know about the murder of that family. If I ever changed my mind, I'd let my parole officer know. But it ain't too likely. You'll be hearing from me." What is certain is the description of Dick's briefcase. A couple of Dick's secretaries, a janitor, a colleague of Dick's, all confirmed the description. It was a tan cowhide briefcase, which had never been found. What was odd was that Joe didn't remember what Dick's briefcase looked like. Funny how much time he spent with him, day after day, like a brother. You didn't know that?
Yeah, but everybody else around him did. And of course that guy's not going to cop to a murder that he's not charged with.
Right.
Unless they're giving him immunity on it. And why would you give the murderer immunity on the murder?
Exactly.
So, yeah. So it's looking like Joe is still the suspect. He just hired 2 henchmen to do it. He gave them money and the gun. But I'm still feeling like the accountant is in on this. The accountant cannot be clean. The accountant is the one where all the money was coming from. And it kind of feels like the accountant took as much money as possible and then kind of dipped out and left Joe holding the bag. Okay, so the accountant just kind of, I don't know. We're not talking about him that much with all of this.
No, not much talk about him at all.
That's sus in and of itself. So I feel like the accountant had a lot to do with it. The accountant probably gained the most because he was taken when the money was good. And then all of a sudden the money was real low while Robison was up at the cabin with his family thinking he's doing all this big business stuff. Meanwhile, you got Joe making up phony people to call his boss and say that they got big deals happening. So it's kind of like he's playing a shell game with Dick Robison, while the accountant is the one manipulating all the money. It just sounds like the accountant was really the brains behind it, but Joe was the idiot that got it done. And Joe thought he was winning over and ended up paying 10 times over in karma, which is how karma works.
Yeah, and the other thing I'm thinking about too is, which makes sense, because, right, so remember, there were shots fired through the window. Dick was shot in the chest, and one of his sons was shot in the back. So that, to me, I see that as being Joe. He's the sharpshooter, remember? He could have
Right.
just been the one to do that. Meanwhile, the other dudes are at the ready at the door.
Yeah.
That's where I'm at.
All right. So
Okay.
what else is there?
All right. So the detectives still had to follow up on a few things. One, the black suitcase of guns, and two, that manila envelope. So back down south they went to Alabama. They needed to find the foundry Alexander told them about. He had described rusted-out boxcars, mechanical cranes, metal crushers, and a junkyard surrounding a steel plant. What a perfect place to get rid of something, right? But the envelope, where could that be? From what they were told, Alexander's brother was headed to Chicago with him. But they also learned that just before they visited Alexander in prison, that particular brother was killed in January of 1970, and it was gang-related. The brother's apartment had been searched by Chicago PD after the murder, but no envelope was found. From Alexander's parents, they learned that they had sent their other sons to Chicago to collect their dead son's belongings. Again, they never found an envelope. Next, the detectives went back to Michigan and stopped at Jackson Prison, where Robert Matthews was serving his time. Matthews confirmed that he knew both Alexander and Brock. No, he didn't kill the Robisons. Robert passed his polygraph test on March 16, 1970. On April 13, 1970, Alexander failed his polygraph test. Everything that Alexander told detectives should have been disregarded at this point. But in the late summer of 1973, a blue 1965 Chevy coach was found abandoned on the side of a Michigan road. They found a luggage tag bearing the name Shirley L. Robison, and the address on the tag was 18790 Dolores, Lathrop Village, Michigan. That's where they used to live, not the cottage. All right, let's get back to Joe. It's 1973. Joe's deeply in debt. He owed money to everyone, and I mean everyone. He was living with his mother. Now, I'm not sure where his wife and son were at this point, but Joe was feeling the heat big time. Not only was he drowning in debt, but he couldn't take the pressure anymore. He felt that the murders of the Robisons were going to be put on him and that the detectives were coming. Joe had sent his mother out on an errand, and while she was gone, he had written a letter to her. Now, I found the letter that he had written, and it looks like a 2-pager, but online I could only see the back portion of it. It said, "Mother, where do I start? I'm a liar, a cheat, a phony. Any check that any of the people have with your signature on it isn't any good because I forged your name to it to get them off my back. I owe everybody you can think of. I have made poor investments, and in some cases, no investment at all. Jim Kinsler wasn't trying to get me money. He had already done so, and I owe him money. I love you dearly, but living only causes you more heartache." And this is what I find interesting. In the letter, he spelled ache, A-K-E. Doesn't make any sense. He got into Harvard. "I know I'm sick, but seeking help isn't going to help the people I've hurt." And then he lists some names: Hood, Ketch, Garatoski, Zachary, Pfluger, Lee, both Lucases. "I just can't help myself. Please understand. Love, Joe." Now, that was all typed up, like I said. But then there was writing on the paper that said, "P.S. I had nothing to do with the Robisons. I'm a cheat, but I am not a murderer. I'm sick and scared. God and everyone, please forgive me. I hope my family will understand, Mother. Please do not come in here. I will already be gone. Joe." So, There it is. Who do you think killed the Robisons? Was it Joe? Was it Joe conspiring and hiring others to kill Dick and his family because of Joe's greed? I will leave you with this. A medium, a very well-respected one, who was a local woman of good heart, in August of 1969. Her name was B. Ann Gaiman. She was asked what vibration she could feel when she walked the property of the Robisons. She said, quote, "A riding stable, a church, and a yacht harbor are all involved in the murders. All I can get is the money. It's something to do with the father's business and with his money. And I'm afraid that's all I can do."
It's definitely the accountant. And why they didn't look into him further or seemingly at all is bonkers to me. It's the accountant. He is where all the money was. He is where all the money funneled through. He was paying Joe. I mean, Joe was writing his own checks, and the accountant was seeing that. And the accountant readily pointed that out to the cops, that he was forging checks. But the accountant was very well aware that these checks were, A, being written, being signed, being cashed, and forged, and didn't say anything while they were being forged.
All in cahoots.
He needed a scapegoat.
Well, I'd be interested to know who the listeners think it was, and you've given them a new thread on the accountant. So this episode was a doozy. It exhausted me. It's huge. And again, my main source, there's a lot of sources that I looked at, but my main source is a book by Marty Link, When Evil Came to Good Heart, an Up North Michigan cold case. I would definitely recommend people give this book a read. It's quite wonderful. This episode is going to wrap up season 2. And next week, we will start season 3. I did want to share a little something because I'm just humbled with what we've accomplished so far in just 4.5 months. I want to kind of read off to you where our listeners are. So we have a ton of listeners in the United States. Second to that is Australia, then Jamaica, United Kingdom, Ireland, Canada, France, Sweden, Albania, Mali, Mexico, New Zealand, and 2 unidentified countries. And I am just floored and so thankful. So please keep coming back, everyone, because we're just getting better and better, and we're just getting started. So what do you think about that, Christine?
Very cool.
Yeah, it's super cool, and I just want to throw out a big thank you, everyone. Please keep listening. Please keep coming back. Thank you so much. We'll see you back on Wednesday for our last round robin for season 2, and then we're going to kick off season 3. So keep coming back, everyone. Thanks so much. Have a great week.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.